Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on biodiversity credits. And I know it's the last session of the day, so we have purposefully moved the tables aside. I'm a serial innovator, so we have innovated the stage so that we can have a really robust discussion. It's a very chatty topic, so this is an invitation to everybody here to please engage with this expert panel on biodiversity credits, and we're hoping to really have quite a lot of Q&A and get into some granular detail. So my name is Candace Stevens. I have the privilege of being an ILCN steering committee member. I'm the CEO of the Sustainable Finance Coalition. We work across Africa to develop sustainable finance solutions for nature. And I also co-chair the IUCN WCPA Sustainable Finance Specialist Group. So it's quite a few hats, but you'll notice that all hats speak to sustainable finance for conservation, something that I'm hugely passionate about, as are our panelists. And I think it goes without saying that we all know the enormous finance for nature gap that we're currently facing. So the big question that's being put before all of us, if we have any chance of reaching our very ambitious conservation targets, is how we're going to plug that gap. And it's not just about increasing the amount of finance available, it's ensuring that the finance we create is targeted at the point of impact, that it reaches the people and places that need it the most. And this is something that biodiversity credits really need to be cognizant of. And as a collective, I think we've heard throughout the day in all the conservation finance sessions how critically important collective action is, working across sectors, working in radical partnerships with one another. And in that, we need to be able to challenge one another from the conservation sector to the finance sector in really understanding what impact looks like and how do we measure it. So biodiversity credits are by no means the silver bullet in financing nature. I don't believe there is such a thing. There is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. We need a diversified toolbox of finance solutions that we can apply in a tailored way to the landscapes and seascapes and the people that are custodians of them. And so biodiversity credits are one of those potential solutions. And I say one on purpose. Biodiversity credits are a huge talking point. There are discussions happening all over the show. It's the new kid on the block that's garnered everybody's attention. But there are a lot of questions that still float around biodiversity credits. And that's the discussion we'd like to have today. What are biodiversity credits? How do we make sense of interchangeable terminology? Biodiversity credits, nature units, verifiable impact units. There are projects mushrooming on every continent. There are experts and global thought leaders working as rapidly as they can to unpack and define the space and support stakeholders. And there are practitioners on the ground that are racing to try and maximize on this new opportunity. So we have a really expert panel with us today, and we want to pick their brains and unpack some of the experiences that they've had and the multitude of discussions that are ongoing around biodiversity credits. Things like who's going to buy biodiversity credits? Who's already bought biodiversity credits? How much did they pay for those biodiversity credits? How do you put a unit of measurement on something as complex and incredible as biodiversity? What is insetting and why do we need to consider it? How do you bring biodiversity credits and carbon credits together? What do we mean when we talk about bundling? Where does the demand actually come from? All of these types of questions, I'm not making the promise that we have all the answers, no pressure panel, but we'd like to have that discussion today. So with that, I'm going to start with our first expert. Tim Mayle is the Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. Tim has been on many biodiversity credit panels and discussions and brings with him a wealth of expertise. So with that, Tim, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just quickly, the organization I lead cares about private finance because when set up the right way, it can deliver the scale and speed of progress that we need for many things. Everything from lead pipe replacement in America's water systems to biodiversity. So I'll just say that about us. We're not project developers. We work on the policy side of things like biodiversity credits. And I'm going to focus on, although my accent gives it away that I'm from this continent, I'm going to talk mostly about the United Kingdom and specifically England's biodiversity net gain program. But I know more probably about the Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act and what are effectively biodiversity credits, compliance credits under those two laws. A biodiversity credit, as defined by the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, is a measured and evidence-based unit of biodiversity improvement that has additionality and durability. So a lot of those terms could be unpacked. We can unpack them in discussion, but they'll be familiar to people from carbon credit and other types of credit discussions. I wanted to show this slide because, and this is a great point for discussion and debate, but when I think of the application of biodiversity credits, this whole universe on this slide is ultimately a place where biodiversity credits can be applied. So a philanthropist can say, I want to know that you're producing a quantified outcome with my money. Show me. And that can be a source of demand for biodiversity credits. I mentioned the Endangered Species Act, Biodiversity Net Gain in England, and the Clean Water Act. That's regulatory offsetting that can create demand for units of wetlands, forests, streams, or biodiversity. And then disclosure offsetting, especially coming from Europe, associated with financial rules and regulators who are saying, tell us what your cumulative effect through your supply chain on nature is, and do something about it. And the do something about it part could lead to the use of biodiversity credits. So, England has been working on a version of biodiversity credits for at least a decade. But starting in the beginning of this year, in 2024, they launched a requirement for anyone who's developing land. It actually phases in for different types of developments over a period of time. But anyone who's developing a piece of land that has nature on it, to measure that nature using a standardized England-wide measurement system, and then figure out how to replace it plus 10%. This is an example of the Greater Manchester Habitat Bank, 49 hectares. These are basically a vision, the two pictures on my left and lower, are visions of what the property will look like after it is restored and enhanced. But they're basically many of the projects, or most of the projects, involve taking a piece of degraded land that's typically been used for farming, pasture, grazing for 100 or 1,000 years, changing the density of livestock or eliminating it completely, creating wetlands, restoring stream channels, bringing some wildlife species back, planting the landscape to get an image like you see here. And there's just started to be transactions in England's program with projects like this. There are requirements that credits be purchased near the locations of impact. And I'm going to show this slide, but not talk about it at length. But importantly, in England's system, and it used to be a feature of America's system, if you were developing a property and you wanted to just do something positive for nature on that property site, a version of insetting, you could do some restoration on a part of the property that you're going to leave alone. And in fact, in England, one of the main ways that developers are complying with this law is to do restoration on the development site or to set aside land on the development site. And so there are biodiversity credits that a third party is providing somewhere else, where usually a property that's exclusively managed for nature, and then there are these projects that are happening side by side with development. And I can tell you later on which one I think is going to produce a better long-term outcome for biodiversity.
Tim, that was very short and sweet, and I think there might be a lot of questions. I think the UK example of a regulatory market is probably one of the most robust that we're looking at currently, but there are many countries that are not even considering what regulatory markets for biodiversity credits would look like. And that brings us to voluntary market purchases. So I'm going to introduce our next expert speaker, and that's Luciana Aquino Hagedorn. She's the chairperson of Carlbo Biodiversity. Unfortunately for us, she's had line of sight of the Swedbank biodiversity credit purchase, which made headlines. And I think there are a couple of lessons that we can glean from that transaction.
Yes, well, hi everybody. Let me get, okay, how do, this, there, okay, sorry. Okay, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about what Carlbo Biodiversity is. It's a Swedish company, an investment company. We are wholly owned by a family investment company that was founded by the founder of EQT. EQT is a European private equity house. We have Alexander, who is Alexander Holmlund, the CEO of Carlbo Biodiversity, has been working with the Swedish University of Agriculture on a research project on biodiversity. We have on our team ecologists, foresters, and as you can see, particularly on the board composition, a lot of global investors. We are developing biodiversity credits in the context of production forests, and our methodology works for those type of forests. So we emphasize diversified production, forest production management, and conservation and restoration. Currently, we have 5 pilot projects in Sweden on land that is not our own. And then we own properties in Scotland, the US, and Uruguay. We also think it's very important to be able to measure very clearly the impact and how the biodiversity is improved. So we have a partnership with Trimetrics, an Irish company, and we are developing a tool. We are also part of the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, and in particular, we are very active with the Swedish Biocredit Alliance. As I said, we are also working with the Swedish Agricultural University, and we have partnerships with different NGOs, including the Conservation Fund. So now I'm going to talk about one of our pilot projects in Sweden, and the one where we actually sold the biodiversity credits. So the project objective was the restoration of biodiversity in production Scots pine forest in the boreal forest of Sweden. There were some active intervention methods, that is the creation of dead wood, the veteranization of living trees through the barking of stems, removing competing vegetation causing unwanted shade, and exposure cutting of a number of specially old trees. On the production side, there's no commercial harvesting in the preservation area nor in the restoration area. And in the remaining area, we have this diversifying forest management. And in this project, that means to switch from a high intensity harvesting to lower intensity harvesting. I also would like to clarify that in the properties we manage, the part that is in production is certified to the highest standards available, like FSC. And then on the rest is where we do this restoration and conservation. And we try to do 60% on production and 40% on restoration or conservation. So as Candace was saying, we had first, we were able to sell some credits, first to Swedbank. We had since then another transaction. We find that this, I mean, of course, these biocredits are very new, but they are attractive to some investors because they provide more resilience to the forest, and also by being able to verify and quantify the improvements, investors can report on that. Well, this is our experience. Happy to answer more questions later.
Thanks, Luciana. I think there are probably going to be some more in-depth questions as we get into the Q&A. But it's just great to have an example of an actual purchase and to have the opportunity to unpack that a little bit. To our third speaker, Alani van Wyk, who is a very close friend and colleague of mine and works shoulder to shoulder with me in the Sustainable Finance Coalition. Alani heads up our impact and led the Biodiversity Credit Incubator, which was Africa-wide. And importantly, out of that incubator are some key principles on biodiversity credit pilots and how to bake in free, prior and conformed consent, and ensuring core beneficiation. So Elani, over to you.
Thanks, Candice. Before I talk about the project, I would just like to give a bit of background on Conserve Global. Conserve Global is a core partner to the Sustainable Finance Coalition. We also work shoulder to shoulder with our core partners and collaborators in developing, implementing and scaling sustainable finance solutions. And for Conserve Global, especially in large community areas, surrounding and connecting national parks and formal protected areas. So Conserve Global's goal is to give communities the opportunity to choose conservation as a preferred land use option with economically viable finance flows from that and communities to benefit adequately from nature positive economies. So for the Tondua Kaputa game management area where this project is being conducted, the main threats are deforestation, burning, and also exacerbated by snares for bushmeat. So there was a huge decline in biodiversity, in species, etc. So they've starting to conduct this project funded by the UK government through the Darwin initiative with several partners, and you'll see at the bottom of the slides all the partners are listed there. Right, so this landscape is in the north of Zambia. It covers about 134,000 square kilometers and serves as a connecting corridor between two national parks. So it is quite crucial in the long-term landscape sustainability of that area. As Candice said, a key focus for this project is FPIC and also early stakeholder engagement. The way to attract involvement of communities, because they are the custodians of biodiversity, is to have them early on in the process. So to do this, stakeholder sensitization meetings are held. One was held in April, where they introduce nature-based projects to communities. What are the benefits? What are the challenges? What are the practical steps of implementation and development of such a project? They received positive feedback from that, and also which emphasized the need for further and continued engagement. Importantly, community scouts are trained, so members of the local community are trained to install and monitor the equipment that is used in the monitoring of biodiversity, which is a key aspect of biodiversity credit projects. So, for example, in this way, the community is intimately involved in the actual working of the project and in creating those biodiversity credits that they will eventually benefit from. And then one highlight of this project was a workshop conducted or facilitated by EcoTrust Uganda. They're very experienced and also in other projects too, carbon and biodiversity credit projects. So this one was called the Gender Action Learning System, or in short, GALS. So this is where communities were taken through a course over 5 days, where they were equipped with skills such as long-term visioning for their own futures, setting objectives for themselves and their families, and also their communities, identifying and dealing with challenges that they face every day, addressing gender issues, and also, importantly, identifying opportunities for activities that will improve both livelihoods and biodiversity conservation. So those are just a few photos of what was conducted, or activities conducted in the project, or in the GALS workshop. Each of the community members or participants were given blank pages, and they were asked to map out their own vision for themselves in the near future, and what objectives they may have for themselves, what challenges they will envision they need to face and overcome. And that gives them a clear path in terms of what they want to achieve in life. Therefore, basically empowering them to look after their own livelihoods in a way that also benefits conservation and their landscapes. And then finally, Conserve aims to benefit communities in projects like this by at least 70% of the finance flows from the sale of credits, and then eventually to leave the community projects, to exit the community projects after 10 years, having empowered the communities adequately to continue with conservation as an economically viable model. Thanks, Candice.
Thanks, Alani. I think it's critically important for us to think about what it looks like to make decisions collectively and to ensure that we are baking into the design process of any biodiversity credits the people who actually live in those landscapes. There are many discussions that happen at high levels, many discussions that happen in boardrooms, and the amount of time and energy that goes into engaging with local communities, particularly in the context like Alani has unpacked now, those are critically important stepping stones that we have to follow so that we can start to create biodiversity credit projects that are designed by, for, and with local communities. Like Alani said, 70% of that finance being dedicated into the community. And in the biodiversity credit incubator that was run in Africa, we set some of those principles and thresholds of what that should actually look like. What should core beneficiation look like? What types of percentages and thresholds should we set? And I think it's a lesson learned from what's happened with carbon finance and some of the disasters that have happened in the news, that we learn from that and we ensure that we're actually baking in key principles to biodiversity credit projects from the get-go. So with that, I'm going to take us to our fourth speaker. So Ash Knopp is the CEO of Wilderlands in Australia, and they are busy with some really innovative and exciting biodiversity credit work around their biological diversity unit. And Ash, it would be great to hear from you some real on-the-ground practitioner experience.
Thanks, Candice. And kudos to my fellow panellists who are very disciplined with keeping within time. I hope I'm able to do that as well. I will be speaking to specific examples of who's buying biodiversity credits and why within the Australian context. But before I jump into that, it might be helpful to get a little bit of an understanding of who we are and what we do. We often start by saying, imagine if you could pick a square metre of vulnerable Australian habitat and protect it forever. You could learn about its unique flora and fauna, you could receive regular updates from ecologists on the ground, you could watch as nature flourishes thanks to your support. This is what Wilderlands makes possible. So we've created one of the world's first voluntary biodiversity credits. Ours is known as the Biological Diversity Unit, or BDU. And each BDU represents a unique 1 square metre plot of permanently protected, actively managed vulnerable habitat. I will go in briefly into the methodology and we can certainly follow up with further questions. But in short, from an Australian context, we support private land conservation through the use of conservation covenants, which ensures permanent protection of remnant vegetation. Our focus is on conserving existing native vegetation. There are many other great schemes looking at restoration and revegetation. Our focus is on the protection of what already exists. There are core principles to our methodology, which I'll touch on very briefly. Probably the number one is permanent protection. This is done through state-based legal mechanisms in Australia known as conservation covenants, known elsewhere as conservation easements, that are managed by the state. In Victoria, an organisation by Trust for Nature that has a lot of representation here this week. In New South Wales, it's the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, and etc. These are government organisations that oversee and mandate conservation covenants on private land, ensuring that management of remnant vegetation is done so appropriately based on management plans. So if you want, that's kind of like the stick. And the carrot comes in the form of payments to those landholders to support that activity through the sale of biodiversity credits. That payment through our sale of credits is for 20 years. And the way that that works is on the sale of a credit, we take a commission, but the vast majority goes to the project. 40% of those funds go to the project up front to help with the initiation of that, but the remainder is managed on the behalf of the project and paid annually based on that project and the team fulfilling the management plans. So in some respects, that's the carrot along with the stick. Like a lot of carbon projects, we also set aside a loss buffer of a project, so we don't sell the full 100%, but 20% is set aside for, I guess, natural impacts and the like. Sitting alongside our methodology, there's a lot of detail in there, happy to jump into that. But sitting alongside that is our technology, which unitises these projects down to unique 1 square metre plots, which are geotagged, independently registered on an independently managed registrar. And in a sense, when those credits are purchased, obviously the units are retired on that register and a certificate is produced for that buyer to make what claims they wish, and we'll touch on that momentarily. So that's it in a nutshell, very high level overview. I thought it might be helpful just to very quickly touch on how we price our BDUs, and it's fair to say that right now it's very rudimentary. In time, we will add through the gathering of data, through a greater understanding of top-down integration of an aggregation of other inputs, such as what are the ecosystem service values of these properties, what is the cultural heritage value, what is the tourism value, and etc. But right now there are a few core, I guess, variables that go into the price of a BDU. One is, what is the cost to purchase that project in the first place? So these are projects that haven't been established as conservation projects prior. With the adoption of our methodology, the covenant is placed on, and within Australian context, that probably means you're putting a tax on your property. If you were to sell that property into the market, being privately owned, you're probably going to be selling it to fewer buyers, buyers that are wanting to adopt a conservation covenanted property, but nevertheless it's likely coming at a reduction. And so we factor in that reduction or the purchase of that price as part of the credit. There's often a cost to the covenanting process, not always. There's obviously a cost that we place on top in terms of unit management and establishment and the registry costs and so on. And then the biggest cost is the active management of these lands. These lands are privately held. They are often surrounded by cleared agricultural land. So it's critically important that they are managed, particularly with pest and weed management, and that comes at a cost. And that cost is aggregated, as mentioned, over 20 years. Then there's our ongoing management, monitoring, I should say, and reporting back. So that's a breakdown of how BDU is priced. Now, what does it actually look like? What are the 4 projects that we've got? We have partnered with one conservation organisation in Australia who have been brave enough to adopt our methodology 2.5 years ago now, who, without any promise of us being able to sell a credit, have committed to actively managing and protecting these projects forever. And these represent different ecosystem types. Tall forests, grasslands, woodlands, and probably the most prominent project that we have is a flagship project that's been developed by Cassinia Environmental in concert with the traditional owners, the Ngarrindjeri. And from the outset of that project, Cassinia Environmental committed to handing the land back to its traditional owners upon a milestone of the sale of so many voluntary biodiversity credits, which would ensure that there's funding for ongoing stewardship to support the traditional owners in that ongoing management. And I'm pleased to share that we've just actually hit that trigger. So we're about to go through a process to support that land handback. And we'll obviously be continuing to sell credits from that project because there's still plenty of credits to sell, but it's a fantastic outcome and it's something that we anticipate we'll be doing more of. In fact, it's going to be an imperative moving forward. Indigenous-led and owned projects is our goal. Now, these 4 projects have unlocked 5 million BDUs, which is the equivalent of 500 hectares. Each project is between 30 and 400 hectares. Roughly, and that can include other non-biodiversity credited areas. But we deal in 1 square metre units because it's attainable, because it can engage hearts and minds and individuals as well as obviously at a corporate level. So I can touch on some more projects, but let's get into who's buying these and why. Now, I'd love to be able to sit here and talk about how we're engaging with TNFD early adopters and they're signing up and buying big tranches of BDUs to support their nature positive journeys. And look, frankly, we're having some fantastic conversations, but unfortunately, that's pretty much the extent of it. There's a lot of great conversations going on. This is all we do. Our company, we're a small startup, we've got 5 staff, most of us are part-time. We wake up every day trying to work out who's going to buy biodiversity credits, who's going to sponsor the work on the ground. And because there's no market, and I often joke that we've created a product that nobody wants in a market that doesn't exist, we can't wait for the market to exist because as a startup, as a social enterprise, we've got to prove our viability. We've got some very patient investors, but they're not going to hang around forever. So we wake up every day going, okay, who can we partner with? How can we demonstrate that these are viable products in the environmental market? And so it starts with the nice to haves, right? So here's a few demonstrations of the nice to haves. For instance, we work out of an innovation precinct within Melbourne Uni, but the actual property is owned and managed by Lendlease, which is a big property company. They were running a sustainability summit in that very building, and we convinced them, don't just talk about sustainability, let's do something. So they agreed to protect the footprint of that space, which was 5,800 square metres. We then created 10 square metre bundles of protection for each of the delegates to take home. So rather than just have a conference tote bag, they had something meaningful to go home with. And then we created an augmented reality experience in the foyer to bring nature into the space, birds flying around your head and that kind of thing. We've subsequently engaged with a staff gifting platform who, through their clients, have started to offer 10 and 20 square metre bundles of protection alongside a bottle of wine or a keep cup. And nearly 20% of staff are choosing that product, our product, which is a fantastic outcome, and it's certainly something that we want to build upon. Then there's products. For those who can see, there's on this table here at the front, a beautiful coastal wildflower duo that's been co-developed and co-designed with a beauty brand out of Adelaide. Now, Adelaide happens to be 2 hours north of our Coorong Lakes project. And this beauty brand, we're inspired by this particular project and have created, with our help, a product that has scents and flora and the colours of the region. And for every product sold, 1 square metre or 1 credit has been sold. And I'm pleased to share that within 3 months, the entire 9,000 units was sold out. They're by far their biggest product. So it's a small but really important demonstration of how credits can be used, because our credits are valued between $3 and $10 at a retail level, depending on the project. And it's a really neat price point to align with a whole range of things. And it's part of the reason why we've gone to that granularity. So there's some examples of nice to haves. I guess some examples of where, and this is ultimately where we need to get to, is how are we solving business problems? How are we genuinely being a part of a consideration? And I've got 3, only 2 up here. The first one is in the built environment sector. So unlike in the UK where the biodiversity net gain has been legislated, they've kind of gone from 0 to 100 and brought in legislation, and there's a lot of scrambling going around. How are we actually going to do this? And there's some great examples from the Environment Bank and other projects that are starting to initiate. There is no legislation like that in Australia, but there are accreditation schemes that incentivise engagement, whereby if you're looking to build a high-rise or a new community, you can accrue credits towards your overall outcome by sponsoring off-site conservation projects. And the benefit of our product, I guess, is that we've got a very set price point per square metre, and we're likely got a project that's not far from maybe within your state or not far from where your development is. And so we can very easily pull together a proposal that fulfills your requirements towards that accreditation scheme. And over the last 6 months, we've written something in the vicinity of 25 proposals that equate to roughly 800,000 square metres. And for us, that's worth $2.5 million, which is groundbreaking for, I guess, where we're at in our journey. The problem is buildings take forever to build, so it could be quite a few years for some of those to land. But nevertheless, it's another example. One other thing I'll throw in here too is that increasingly we're seeing biodiversity credits like ours stapled to carbon credits. So the stapling is whereby within Australia, you may choose to purchase Australian carbon credit units, ACCUs, that vary between $30 and $40 per tonne, I should say, to fulfil your net zero aspirations. Or you may choose to buy an international quality carbon credit at much reduced rate, but you also want to tell an Australian story. So what you may choose to do is buy your carbon credit to offset your net zero and then buy a biodiversity or BDU on top of that as a staple to tell an Australian protection story. So we've engaged with a number of distributors or brokers who are starting to sell our product to Australian corporate buyers in that way. It's slow, but it's growing. I'm going to leave it there and we'll touch on some nature positive a bit later on, Candice.
Thank you, Ash. I don't know about you, but I loved all the innovation that's being attached to biodiversity credits there. But I think it does bring us to a really critical juncture. Something that we just have to own right now is that biodiversity credits, it's so nascent. It's not like, you know, big money is moving in any of these transactions. There are lots of different predictions around what that would look like. There are great forecasts and reports from the World Economic Forum on that, but right now that's not where we're at. And so the big question, you know, particularly in my mind, is the demand. So in the regulatory side, like Tim unpacked, it's legislated. It's you must. This is what you must do, and this is essentially what the regulation looks like of how you do it. So if we don't have a you must do it, and it's on the voluntary side, then the big question is why? Why would a corporate, for example, buy biodiversity credits? And there's Ash unpacked a lot of different examples, different things that we could use to create that type of hook. For me, the fundamental question, and I'm not sure we have an answer for this, is how do you ensure that there is an investment in nature for nature's sake when you can't necessarily attach a financial return? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, and we've had great panels on that today, you know, on real asset value and where revenue streams come from, what blended finance looks like, all of those different combinations, and so biodiversity credits can sit in that mix. And so, Ash, I'm going to start with the question to you around that demand side and your experience, and just put it bluntly, why would a corporate buy this?
Well, outside of the examples that I've shared, where we're seeing companies who are yet to engage meaningfully at an ESG or nature positive level, we've unlocked opportunities to engage with staff, with products, with brands, and etc. But the market will only really move when companies are taking this seriously. And I think it's fair to say that as good as the TNFD has been, how quickly it's been rolled out and how we're starting to see adopters, until there is mandating of action upon those goals and targets that companies are setting, companies are not going to move. And I've got a prime example of this. Earlier in the year, we were engaged by a European renewable energy company that's a TNFD early adopter. And they came to us and said, well, look, we've got operations in Australia. We'd like you to, based on your methodology, identify whether or not we could fulfil our nature positive aspirations, which their definition was outside of compliance and regulation, having fulfilled what they need to implement those projects. What would it take for us to protect the equivalent footprint of our operations in net positive using our methodology? And so what we did is we assessed each of their assets based on the footprint of those operations. Solar farms, pretty easy to do. Wind farms, it was basically each wind turbine was the equivalent of 1.5 hectares. Can we establish projects alongside these operations using our methodology on those sites? And what we quickly determined was one of them we definitely couldn't, on another we could, but not to fulfil all of their requirements, and on another we could create surplus. And where we got to was providing them with a very detailed breakdown of how this works, and this is the concept of insetting. The idea there was we then went back to them with a very detailed proposal to say, well, to fulfil nature positive aspirations based on our methodology on these 3 projects, this is what it's going to take. And we were very close, at least we felt we were very close to having a pilot project initiated. I was kind of hoping that we'd be able to do it in time for this conference and for COP16 to make some noise about what would have been one of the world's first demonstrations of this. But sadly, the global, their situation, frankly, the global team has cut funding for such projects for the foreseeable future. We weren't given much detail, but what we did know is we had approval up the chain on what we'd proposed. We felt very confident that we were going to land this, and it stopped there. And so I'm not sure if I'm directly answering your question, other than to say that there's plenty of reasons why companies are exploring this, and there's also plenty of reasons why they're not engaging. And until there's mandating, and until, frankly, we're looking for leadership, until one company or several companies show leadership in this space, there's not enough out there to encourage others to do it. Because I've recently heard, even in Canada, they've brought in a law whereby board members can be held liable if found greenwashing. Now, as well-meaning as such a law may be, all it's going to do is stop companies from innovating, to showing some guts, some putting themselves out there. I understand that you've got to do it right. Absolutely, risk is a massive consideration, but we also need to see some leadership.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I think those are key nuggets to leave with. Really bold leadership, and that we still haven't quite jumped that hurdle yet from conversation to commitment. So, Luciana, I'm going to move to you for you to share a little bit more on the Swedbank side of things, because they actually made that decision, made that commitment.
Yeah, so Swedbank is a very big bank in Sweden. A big part of their business is to fund forestry transactions, so they are very interested. They participate in the market already. They provide financing in these type of transactions. They saw this transaction as a learning opportunity, and they are not using it for offsetting. Then there was another transaction that we closed recently. This is the Devi Group. It's a telemarketing company also based in Sweden. And their motivation is mostly branding, and their CEO is very invested with the protection of the environment. So these were the motivations. In one case was exploration, learning more about what's happening in an industry where this bank is very active. And then in the other case, mostly branding. I mean, it's challenging to find buyers. Some of other potential buyers we are talking with, and this is all about these projects we have in Sweden, are companies that have an impact in those areas where we have the projects. And that seems to be one of the main drivers that can really make a sale close, very similar to what Ash was saying.
So Tim, I'm going to move to you. While we're sitting in this very nascent space around biodiversity credits, there's a lot of bundling happening with carbon credits. And if you can just unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, that's a dangerous question to ask me, because I think it's a very bad idea, is the honest answer. Imagine somebody said to you and said, we want to do grizzly bear projects in Canada. And you said, oh, I've got this great pollinator meadow. Let's turn it into a grizzly bear project. The focus is on grizzly bears. Don't try to sell a product that was produced for some other market for another purpose. At the beginning when it's the hardest. So the key, for me, the key lesson of the front page stories you may have seen about the carbon market in Guardian or Bloomberg or the New York Times or, right, is that additionality is really hard on avoided loss projects, which is what most carbon projects are. And there's a huge number of stranded asset carbon projects around the world now. So the very worst thing to do is to take products that have really struggled in one market and then try to sell them in a different market with the same reporters who are paying attention and the same buyers, many of whom have been burned very badly by their carbon market experience. So to me, the lesson is not to stack stuff. If you're imagining that the market is $1 billion in the next 5 years, it's not going to go to 300 billion. Right? 1 billion or maybe 5 billion in 5 years, right? Then if you have one project in your portfolio that's going to be a biodiversity credit project, make it a project that you can really clearly demonstrate additionality for, restoration or dealing with severe threats like invasive species, where it's absolutely crystal clear that you can document something to your mother that's different on this property. That's the way to start biodiversity credit projects. It's not to bundle. And I know there's lots of bundle projects out there, and some of the team on this stage may have them, but I would never advise an investor to buy a stacked project, because I have no idea, and I've spent a lot of time with reporters, I have no idea how to get them to not want to write about it.
So I think something that gets encountered over and over again in the financing for nature question is the biodiversity side of things is so complicated, and we haven't been able to integrate it enough into the financial sector. The two are slowly coming together, conservation and finance, but it's so tricky, and so it's very tempting and easier to be able to go down paths that we've trod before and to say we're going to follow the carbon credit road because that's a road that we've gone down before, and financing biodiversity is just that little bit harder. So looking at biodiversity credits, where we would really want to see investment in nature for nature's sake and biodiversity at the heart of it, means that we do need to dig a little deeper. And we do need to be a little bit more patient to push that out. And I think I agree with what Tim said here is, you know, it's so tempting to be able to bundle it and to go down a road that we've walked before. And I think that brings us to what are the building blocks? What are the critical ingredients that need to be in place for a biodiversity credit project? So Alani, I'm going to come to you just to touch on a couple of those building blocks that we've unpacked with so many stakeholders from many different countries. It's an African experience that we have, but it's allowing a lot of local communities and indigenous peoples to be able to take hold of what do they need to have at their disposal.
Yes, so I think as I talked about earlier about early engagement and FPIC for local communities, and as Kathleen also in this morning's session said that land access for local communities is so crucial, and the rights to resources and the rights to land, etc. But that's just one of the things that's important for local community engagement. They need to be, if they are the custodians of the biodiversity in a specific area, they need to be so intricately part of the project. They need to be adequately beneficiated. There needs to be integrity in the system. There needs to be robust methodologies and measurements and monitoring and evaluation. So I think a lot of the building blocks are there already. it is just a matter of putting them into practice and testing them. And because biodiversity credit projects are generally in the long term, hopefully in the long term, and there's permanence, hopefully, it's quite difficult now to see whether those building blocks that we've identified that need to be there are going to contribute to the custodians of biodiversity actually benefiting from that, and biodiversity actually benefiting from that. So there are a few building blocks. We had one building block which we called replicable, but it might not be a very viable building block. It might be an optional building block, but for biodiversity that's so complex, as you said, it's not always going to be easy to replicate it. But yeah, there are so many different methodologies. One can talk endlessly about that. But yeah, the building blocks need to be in place.
We haven't even begun to touch on methodologies and the proliferation of them all over the place. I can see some chuckles at the back. So I'm going to open up to all of you. This is the chance to really get into a little bit more detail with our panelists. So I see hands going up all over. I'm going to move along with the roving mic and bring it to you. Right, hands up first, David.
Okay, thanks everybody. It is a very hot topic, so great to hear your perspectives. One of the things I guess that kind of nags me with the biodiversity credit concept is going down the route of applying additionality to biodiversity conservation. It kind of leads you to the outcome where the guy who, or the person who's done the right thing and protected their forests and stewarded them well gets nothing, whereas the person who trashed their forest 20 years ago and restores it gets biodiversity credits. It seems, you know, maybe that concept doesn't work very well for biodiversity.
I think there might be a question in there, David. Maybe I'll just quickly answer from my perspective. So as we focus on protecting remnant, in Australia, there has been mechanisms like conservation covenants in some states for 50 years. And some incredible altruistic landholders have gone about that with no financial support or gain. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to create an incentive to help, I guess, engage more landholders to do that. But it does leave 50 years of incredible people who have done that without that, the support. And it's something that we're looking at. But have to be obviously conscious of the additionality piece. Yeah, please.
I mean, the world's not fair. And honestly, ask anyone who's existed in any country with a farm subsidy program whether the same condition doesn't exist. So it's really unfair to impose this burden on just biodiversity, right? Because biodiversity on the planet has gotten screwed for 1,000 years, right? We can't solve a systemic problem that stewards of any resource, right? Aesthetic, a view, don't get paid today. That's not just a biodiversity problem. It's a systemic problem through our whole system. So I think it would be nice to fix it. And one way to fix it would be to set a point in time and say, anything you can document in your property today that changes, even if you're not in a market, is valuable someday. And actually England did that kind of accidentally. They're trying to deal with fraud. And they said, look, it's 2020 forward, if you have a baseline, at some point in the future, you can put that baseline into the unit of a credit and sell it. Which means that in 2080, right, someone who changed their land management back in 2020, as long as they have some data, like we heard about in the tech panel, that they could turn that into a biodiversity credit and get value, to your point. But I just don't think we can fix 1,000 years of our economic system not paying people who've done the right thing in this market.
I totally agree with you, Tim. We have to start at some point, and I think now is probably the best. In production forest, I mean, we are actually taking land out of production and putting it to biodiversity, so that's where we see the additionality.
So I think the nugget I got there is if you're sitting on data and you can build a baseline and hold on to that, you know. So we had, yeah, Roberto?
Okay, hi. It seems to me that with the biodiversity credits, there's a risk, a challenge, and also an opportunity, because carbon credits is very mathematics. You have to measure in tons. But biodiversity is not mathematics. You know, it's what you want to be preserved. So in that case, for example, for voluntary markets, you just need to agree on what you value and what you want to be valued. It could be just keeping the baseline. That could be valued and paid for because you need to pay for management or for protection. And on the regulatory side, which I think is another opportunity where I see that in both two areas. One, the zoning regulations. Sometimes you sell give development rights in exchange of biodiversity contributions or help or credits. And the other one is the impact assessment process, where sometimes certain projects may depend their approval on how they improve or protect biodiversity. And that's something that local governments, regional and national governments can agree on, hopefully on a non-partisan way, when they can also define what kind of biodiversity we want for this place, this region, or this country. And then we create that regulatory market. But I think the opportunity I see is that you can define what you want. You don't need to have additionality or to measure in a certain amount what you're doing or what you're not doing.
Since COP15, where ourselves and a few other biodiversity credit developers back very early doors, including Dr. Tim Coles, who sadly can't be with us on the panel today. Since that point in time, under the UN Biodiversity Credit Alliance and other platforms, there's been robust debate about will there be one biodiversity credit that rules them all, like within carbon. And there's some very strong voices in that room, but I think ultimately the conversation is understanding that biodiversity is too diverse. Nature is too diverse to have perhaps one singularity. But you touched on a really good point, and that is carbon you can measure, but biodiversity and nature you can feel and experience. We often talk about the feather and the fur factor. And so the debate continues, though, as to, okay, well, if there is diversity, how do we at least ensure that there's attributes of alignment so that there's fungibility, which will ultimately mean that the market will decide which credits survive and thrive. And so I think all methodology developers, as well-meaning as they are, and there may be too many, there may be too few, but ultimately they're going to be found out based on what buyers want. And it's why we've, I guess, developed what we've developed, which is very Australia-centric. We rely on legislation and infrastructure that focuses on Australia. It may be adapted in other jurisdictions, but that's yet to be tested. But ultimately, I think for us, it's positioning ourselves to be agile enough to move according to what policy is coming down, what landholders ultimately need, and what buyers are going to buy.
All right. I'm going to come to Angelo and then Stephen. You had a question? Yeah.
So first, a short comment on the why certain companies would be interested in buying, at least in good old Europe, thanks to this directive on non-financial reporting. There is apparently a push in that direction. So there are large companies who might be interested in investing money in those credits. But the question is, what do you think about what Candice started pointing to? We are in a moment where the market is starting to be tested in a certain way, developed, tested, look at it the way you want. And at the same time, the regulator seems to be curious and anxious to step in. Should we, in a certain way, be happy if the regulator steps in now at a very early stage? Should we prefer that the regulator sort of facilitates the market without regulating immediately and taking stock of what happens? Or should we simply say, no, regulator, step off, please, because every time you regulate, you do create hurdles because you simply ignore how to do the things?
I can answer. I think regulation can help. I mean, I don't want a lot of regulation, but in the voluntary carbon markets, for instance, the total lack of regulation created a lot of problems, and the players in the carbon market actually would like to have some regulation. So I think that some regulation could be helpful in this market, like, you know, demanding disclosures, maybe giving some guidance on whether it can be considered an asset or not. I mean, there are some very basic things in both the carbon market and the biodiversity market that are not settled. So I think it would be helpful.
I'm not in America right now, so I can say that I love regulation. But just to use it to an analogy, right, is the electric car market in the world right now, where you've got to get the balance right between the supply of the solution and the price of it and the mandates to apply it, right? And the mandates in the electric car market are maybe too stringent, and so you see this, you know, tension working itself out. England had a nutrient neutrality policy that has temporarily at least collapsed because of a lack of supply of credit. So I think there's this balance thing. But for me, it's what the premise for me around biodiversity credits is that biodiversity is just going to get more rare, right? Add a couple billion people and a few more billion people in the middle class, and this is just not going away. And so the idea of developing credits, getting better at producing supply, and watching more and more systems move toward a regulatory structure, I think is the inevitability that I'm banking on. But you mentioned the financial disclosures in Europe, and I think that's kind of the new frontier of environmental regulation, is coming from people with MBAs, not ecology degrees. And so I think there's a version of regulation that stays in that part of our economy, which is quite interesting and could lead to a kind of a more flexible adoption than we've seen in some of the more environmentally regulation-driven systems.
So I was part of a group that published a paper in Science just a few weeks back that looked at the impact of conservation, a whole bunch of things, protected areas, invasive species, you name it, and we measured it. We actually were able to measure a conservation impact. It was enormously hard to do. And whatever metric we come up with will be enormously difficult and lack scientific precision. So my question to you is really about attribution. If you're not able to attribute whatever activity is taken to a conservation gain, which may not be measurable, how are you going to deal with that, especially in nonlinear ecosystems? Like, it may not be the manager's fault that biodiversity goes south, for example. Do they lose the investment as a result of that? How do you deal with that kind of complexity?
I'll just say quickly that it's really important that the credit and the payments be structured around what people can actually deliver, right? So planting, establishing trees, having trees survive for 3 years, but not whether the endangered bird shows up in the tree. And I think that's ultimately that's the way wetland, stream, endangered species crediting works in the United States, and it's intention. And the last thing I just mentioned quickly before passing the mic is the company Ramble has taken England's biodiversity metric and applied it in 26 countries for the kind of disclosures that we were just talking about. And so I do see there's some like standardization that could help, even though it's still inaccurate.
Yeah, the way we do it in our methodology is we actually have payments every year after the land has been in this program and there have been activities performed. So it's not so much on the results, but on the process in getting there and measuring it with this technology tool that I'm talking about.
So that's actually measuring activities conducted in order to protect biodiversity or enhance it. Yeah, so there's one prospective project in South Africa in a certain biome where they're looking at indicator species, or not indicator species, keystone species. I think the debate will be around whether it is an indicator species. Because, I mean, one could protect that biome, but if one unit of that species is introduced into that biome voluntarily, that is not an indication of the activities that they performed. It is like a manual intervention. So I think you're right in saying that there are certain incidental occurrences that cannot be attributed to the project, for example. But I think it's better to look at activities conducted in order to enhance or protect biodiversity or restore it. But yeah, I'm not an expert on measuring that.
I might give an example from the demand side regarding that. There is an Australian-based asset manager, a TNFD early adopter called GPT. They own about 130 assets up the eastern seaboard, anything from warehouses to shopping centres and etc. And they've probably led the way in Australia in regards to coming out and disclosing what nature positive means to them, and that is effectively protecting the equivalent footprint of their entire assets back to pre-settlement, pre-European settlement, so 1750. And so their aspiration over the course of the next 5 years is to protect the equivalent footprint of all of their assets based on remnant vegetation equivalent to what they once were their warehouses and so on once were on. Frankly, it's going to be virtually impossible because a lot of their properties sit on grasslands that are just, as we know globally, very underrepresented. And so they're going to have to get creative. But it's an aspiration, which is great. What we need is some regulation or mandating of companies like that who have made commitments to actually then follow through and to do so ideally sooner rather than later.
So to add my 2 cents worth into that, even with carbon projects where, you know, measuring things we know is just that much more simple, there's still a sellability that comes into it. There's still a marketing, there's still a veneer that's put on things. And I think we just need to own that with biodiversity credits, there's going to be that element too of what sells better to people. All right, I've got Rob. Anastasia, okay.
Thanks, Candice. Just a question just on the nomenclature too of biodiversity credits versus offsets. And certainly if you look at Vera's nature credits, they cannot be used for offsetting purposes. And I wonder if you can just comment on whether there should be biodiversity credits that are used as offsets and some that should not be. So I just wonder your views on that.
I'll quickly give the Australian context. So biodiversity offsets have been utilised for a couple of decades now, particularly offsetting developments, infrastructure projects and the like. And it's a mechanism that's actually been used well and has stopped a lot of developments that would have gone ahead, but for the cost to offset what would have been ploughing through remnant vegetation, endangered species and so on. So that's been one positive outcome. We actually rely on the infrastructure that's developed that biodiversity offset scheme to create ours. We effectively go through the same process, but then we retire our credits off the compliance to only be available then for voluntary. Frankly, looking at the business model right now, you'd ask why, but I guess it's a principled decision. We exist for nature gain, and there are plenty of companies and landholders in Australia who do supply to the offsets market.
Just one thought from the Sustainable Finance Coalition. In our biodiversity credits incubator, we sort of formulated our own method or definition, and we advocate for not including offsetting in biodiversity credits.
Yeah, our credits are not offsets. We think there should be some regulation for that, and it's a lot more complex and probably will bring a lot more noise to this very nascent market.
If anyone's following the U.S. election, you'll know that Republicans tied themselves in knots around whether Donald Trump did or didn't win the election in 2020, with danger on saying on any answer you give. And the same thing is true on the term offsetting credit in the biodiversity space. I mean, but ultimately, like I use the term offset the way I use it when I come home late for dinner 3 times and I bring flowers to my wife, right? I have done something and I'm doing something in compensation. And so there is use of credits that are purely good no one has done anything wrong and they're not accounting for it and they just want to do something good. And then they've done something bad, it's very nebulous, and they want to do something that's good, that's vaguely related. And then there's something they've done bad that's very specific, and they have to deal with that because somebody's paying attention. And where the line is between those things is very difficult, and there are a whole bunch of people who hate markets and capitalism that are thrown into this mix too. So it's really hard to figure that out.
I had a specific question. So in Canada, we're also probably going to have the election, but for now we are discussing and playing with the idea of turning to the asset owners, which are financial institutions, and playing with the idea that central banks do a two-tier interest rate. So basically they do either negative interest rates or zero interest rates for the capital that specifically impact, and they give that capital to central banks. For central bank gives that capital to commercial banks, and then so that way the commercial banks can turn to the companies and say that if you can prove that you are doing something good, let's broaden that, you basically get a preferential interest rate. And then the companies that are proven to not be doing something good, you have to now pay in a much higher borrowing cost. So we're playing with that idea, and I just wanted to get your opinion. So if you imagine now in Canada, we have a particular situation, we have 7 banks only, and we have 2 major credit unions. So it's fairly a monopoly here. So you can imagine if central bank turns around and does something like that, it will have a huge impact on pretty much every company that borrows, every real estate developer, every mining company, everybody. So do you think that would actually stimulate tremendously the demand for example, biodiversity credits? Or do you think it will just lead to a lot of nature washing and greenwashing?
I'll just say quickly, yes, that's like a great example of something that could lead to early adoption. And it might be, as you were alluding to, a little bit flawed at first, but a big part of this is learning at the beginning of the market for buyers and sellers and, using the term regulators, loosely, regulators.
Yeah, that's, for instance, the kind of regulation I think can help to incentivize people to do these type of things. I think that there are other ways to avoid greenwashing and things like that. That's measurement, clear guidelines, good methodologies, good standards, and that's up for the markets and all of us in this space to really ensure that's happening.
I think it's a great aspiration and something that we look forward to, and will frankly, until that point in time, there'll be questions over whether or not a biodiversity market can exist. The challenge being that, say in Australia, as of next year, companies of certain size have to mandatorily disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, and if they're above a certain output, they will be fined accordingly, and that then measured every year, and if they're not reducing year upon year by a certain percentage, they'll continue to be fined. So that's great, and we look forward to that being then implemented from a nature perspective. On the flip side, we understand how challenging it is to actually run a business these days. There are so many things, so many hoops you have to jump through, and this is another thing. And so we're aware of that, and it's why companies are not going to act until they have to. And so as soon as they are forced to act, the better for nature. But understandably, there's going to be a heck of a lot of lobbying against that for some time because of the checks they're having to write for every other social license to operate.
So I can't help it but add a bit to that. I had the privilege of joining an OECD closed workshop on scaling up positive incentives. And as a tax nerd, I love a good incentive. And one of the things that clearly has come out of research over decades is how positive incentives, as opposed to fines, really do change behavior over the long term. And I think it's something to bear in mind when we think about the biodiversity credit and regulatory space. Right, coming to questions.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my question's about the sort of how you think we should balance market integrity with market growth. Because I guess if we can make this market really, really strong, really, really high quality, but that might limit actually its take up. And I mean that from sort of a supply side and a demand side. So on the supply side, I can see from these different methodologies, we've got, I guess, probably at one end, the B&G metric in England, which has 120 plus habitats, different levels of distinctiveness, different unit supply, depending on what habitat and where it is. That's pretty, I would say that's quite high integrity relatively. And then you've got, but the transaction costs of that are relatively high because it's complicated. On the other end, you've got, I guess, 1 square meter of habitat is, all habitats are equal, which again, if we scale the market, may lead to, I guess, the same issues we have in the carbon markets, where weaknesses in the methodology have led to negative press coverage and killed the market. So that's sort of the supply side and where we land on a methodology there, but also on the demand side, and coming back to this offsets question, which I think is really interesting. And I guess you could say in my mind, I think we are missing a trick by just saying we're not offsetting, because we've got comfortable in the carbon markets that there's always going to be residual emissions, that when even by 2050, I don't think any company is going to have 0 emissions. So we've got comfortable with compensating for that. I don't know many supply chains that will have 0 impact on nature. So even by 2050. So and actually the supply chains that are captured in regulatory offset markets are very limited. It's housing, it's development. It's not agriculture. It's not products. So I guess I get with nature there's a local element that isn't relevant for carbon markets. But surely, given all these disclosure regimes like CSRD and TNFD and this massive scrutiny on supply chains, this massive awareness of the impact on nature of supply chains, are we not missing a trick by saying, let's do offsets, but let's limit it to the catchment or the ecological character area of where that impact is? No. Insetting is your own supply chain. I'm talking in the catchment where your supply chain is. It's subtly different. It's subtly different, but it's an important difference.
I mean, I'm not totally against offsetting, but to get offsetting right, you really have to put a lot of guardrails. Like, for instance, in the carbon markets, some people now are saying, okay, you can offset as long as you are working really, really hard to reduce your emissions. Other than that, you cannot start to offset. So that would be, so you need to have those type of things. I think in biodiversity, we have the local element. I mean, you cannot offset. And then, as we were discussing before, you have, how are you going to measure really the impact, the attribution and things like that. So I think there's a lot of thinking that should go, and I guess people that are in the compliance market more familiar kind of already thought about some of these things, but I think it's important if we do it. I think we have to do it right. And you at the beginning you were saying, why, trying, and I lived through a lot of what happened in the carbon markets, and I don't think it was a good thing. Like, I actually think now we are like 5 steps backwards instead of, and when we were 1 step forward. So the damage in the reputation and these type of things for not having good behavior can be really, really serious.
I want to start with a slightly different response to your question, which is, a fundamental question for everybody who works on conservation on this planet is whether we're any good at it. And if you believe that we're just making it up as we go and there's no predictability to what we do, then it's really difficult to build a big biodiversity credit market or any supply. But if you believe that people from straight out of college to grad school to 30 years later know how to predictably produce benefit to nature, right? That's carbon credits. We didn't have that because carbon was a completely new commodity, but people have been producing nature benefits for 300 years or longer, and we're getting better at it. So that's one of the most important things to your question of scale, is the whole ecosystem of conservation is saying, you know what? Like, we're actually pretty good at this. And I don't understand the market piece and the offset piece, but like, at the end of the day, like, if you want us to make more nature, more conservation, more abundant pollinator habitat, we can do that, right? Like, that's not really a question in some ecosystems, right? I know there's caveats. So I would say that's one of the most important things to the market growing. And then your point about like where supply, basically like producing supply and how fast to go, there's this really interesting policy questions, and I'll just mention two. One is, do we really need more habitat in England, or would we rather have it in Gabon? And that's a purely public, it's not a scientific question, it's a purely public policy question, but I would much rather have a new US national park in Kentucky or Tennessee than I would in Wyoming. I would much rather have it because it's full of biodiversity and water, and Wyoming is full of rocks and ice and a lot of rich people who ski. That's a policy choice. It's not really about science, right? It's a policy choice, and we should be thinking about that in these markets. And the second piece associated with policy is, ideally government would actually be saying, look, we have these streams of public money and like International Development Bank money that we currently put into nature stuff. Why don't we say we're gonna put some of that existing money into the production of biodiversity credits? We'll help them, these are loans. And if they can't sell them, we'll just buy them as conservation projects, which succeed because we're good at it, right? And so you create reliable supply with a government incentive to produce it, and you have the backstop of just calling it a conservation project the same way we've been doing it for 100 years if the market doesn't materialize. And I think those kind of government interventions are missing right now. That like, what do we want? And like, could we not give a little bit of stimulus, like industrial policy for nature, for production of those things?
Okay. Yeah, I want to ask three short questions. One is I wasn't very clear on who or what sets the price of the credit. That's one question. The temporality of that. So basically what? It lasts for 20 years and then what? And because also, you know, like Roberto was saying, the CO2 molecules are all the same everywhere. So it's easy to count. But a square meter of land is not the same in the Atacama Desert or the Amazonian region. So that's, and also if there is a third-party accreditation that about the transaction that has been made, so to secure that basically you are doing restoration or conservation or not.
I can answer. So on the price, because we work in production forest, is what you're giving up on production. So that's a basic way of determining the price. Whether that's the price you are transacting at is a different story. There's some cost in the the activities that are performed to restore and later conserve, but that's at least you have a number that you can refer to. As far as the time, forever would be a great answer that I would love to give you. Our projects are 20 years. And the idea, there are some structures like, you can have easements, conservation easement. If you have a conservation easement, probably you won't, and you are paid for that, you probably are not going to get a credit. I mean, you have to look at what are the different options in different places. And then your last question was measurement and third-party accreditation. Yeah, accreditation. So we are very involved with the Swedish Biocredit Alliance. This is an alliance where there are 70,000 small forest owners in Sweden that are part of it. We also have, there's an auditing organization and some nonprofits and governments too, municipalities. So it's a coalition of very different actors. This Swedish Alliance just came up with a global standard, and then methodologies can be accredited by that global standard and then verified by third parties. So we are trying to put all the pieces together, at least in that organization, and that's the goal.
So in our incubator that we ran, one of the opinions, or a few of the opinions were that costing a biodiversity credit should start with what it costs to protect or restore, whatever. And that comes to the question of restoration is much more expensive than protection. But one of the incubator members said, but if you are protecting biodiversity and you are not spending as much money as restoring it, then you can sell your credits for cheaper and you can sell more credits. So that's one opinion. And then in terms of permanence or long-term, I also agree with the easements, and depending on the biodiversity agreements that you may have in the country. In South Africa, we have a certain contract that land is protected for 99 years or longer, which gives you a lot more confidence in the permanence of the project. But that it depends on what your contracts. I would say it starts there.
Just one quick addition. We're very conscious that particularly this early stage pricing of credits, we've got to be very careful that this isn't a race to the bottom. There's a genuine understanding of what the cost will be to manage, and because unlike carbon, we don't have a supply problem, we've got a demand problem. We've been inundated with landholders, conservation organisations, big and small, who'd love to be unitised, but the issue is we can't right now promise them that we're going to be able to fulfil your financing needs to support this activity within the next 3 years or whatever it might be. So that it's both demand and supply is, I guess, the consciousness around pricing. But we do, unlike the carbon market, which is obviously variable and dependent on market forces, when it comes to voluntary biodiversity credits, each credit developer is doing their own thing and pricing. But what's really interesting is, and I believe you're from Chile, sorry. We've got cousins in Colombia, Terrazos, who are doing great things that work in very similar protection of habitat banks concept to what we do. And it just so happens that unbeknownst to us, the pricing of their credits down to 10 square metres was very similar to ours. In how they adjudicated and valued. So I think there's some clear, those who do, there's a bit of art, but there's a lot of science to valuing, getting it kind of right at this point in time.
Right, so I know that we are standing between all of you and cocktails. So I'd really like to thank our guests for everything that they've shared. So Ash, Alani, Luciana, Tim, thank you so much. I feel like we've come away with a real treasure chest of nuggets and food for thought. So thank you for joining us for this discussion, and thank you to our panelists.